And good morning or good afternoon to all of you who are tuning in from around the planet to join us for our Virtual Leadership Summit. My name's Andrew McDowell and I'd like to welcome you. And we hope that this week will give you a number of different lenses, I guess, on which to look at leadership and provide you with an opportunity to be thoughtful about how you're leading yourself and how you can utilize these various leadership perspectives to support you as you develop. So we encourage you this morning just to tune in and maybe turn off some of the distractions around you and allow yourself the time just to reflect on and use this opportunity just to think about leadership. You may also wish to have a pen and paper ready as we're going to be inviting you during this webinar just to make a few notes for yourself. So as I mentioned before, I'm Andrew McDowell. I'm one of the directors and partners at TPC in the UK. But this webinar series and Virtual Leadership Summit has actually been contributed to by our partners in different countries around the world. The Virtual Leadership Summit this year really has a very specific and systematic approach in how we're looking at leadership. On the first day, we'll be looking at personal leadership. That's today. Tomorrow, the idea is to look more into relational leadership. Then we'll be looking at team and organizational leadership, followed by systemic leadership. And then on day 5, as a general topic, another particular lens we can look at is the role of women in leadership. And through all of these different days, there'll be a series of webinars, videos, articles, podcasts, and interviews, which we really hope will support you in your development and your ongoing learning about leadership. We like to think about leadership from a variety of different lenses in this sense. So we talk about personal leadership as a view to, and we're going to be talking about this one today during the webinar. But our view on this is really about how does the individual lead themselves. And if we think about this in terms of just another view on leadership, we can look at that in relationship to leading ourselves, and we know what we're doing around that as best we can. But then it becomes involved in looking at how do we lead through our relationships with others? How do we interact with others? How do we express that personal leadership through our relational leadership? And another view on it is then how does that become evident in how we lead in teams, in our organizations? Another view on it is then how do we actually have an impact and lead systemically, expressing personal, relational, and team leadership to actually impact the system that we're operating in. And as I said, on day 5 of our series this year, we're looking at the specific topic of women in leadership as another lens for thinking about the important issues and factors which impact how women lead as well across the system. So we hope that these different perspectives will provide you with some interesting food for thought in how you're working with these leadership ideas in whatever you're doing and whatever role that you play. So today, as I mentioned before, our specific focus is around personal leadership. So we're wanting to actually use the time to explore the concept of personal leadership. We'll be looking at our approach to what personal leadership involves and give you an opportunity to think about what that means for you as such. And as I mentioned before, we're going to be asking you some questions along the way for you to do some thinking and potentially some writing about. We're also going to talk about the importance of personal leadership and how it has an impact, how it does relate to how people show up as a leader and their overall effectiveness in leadership roles. And I'm also going to use this opportunity to give you an overview of the various content that's available for you during this day across the personal leadership domain. So just before we get started then into looking at what my perspective or what TPC's perspective is around personal leadership, we always think it's important for people to have the opportunity to think about what the topic means to them. So what I'm going to invite you to do just for the next 2 or 3 minutes is just make some notes or reflect and make some notes about this idea of what personal leadership means to you. So just in your own time and doing whatever works for you, just make some notes or do some thinking about what personal leadership actually means to you. What does it mean to you to have a leader who is leading themselves? And what are the essential elements in your mind that might be involved in personal leadership? You might also want to just consider for yourself, if someone is in fact really leading themselves really well, what do you think they'd need to know? For someone who's really leading themselves well, what do you think they'd need to be able to do? And finally, for someone to lead themselves really well, how do you feel they would actually need to be? And of course, we're talking about someone else, but this is obviously most important and relevant to you and how you lead yourself, what you feel you need to know, what you feel you need to be able to do effectively, and how you need to be in yourself to actually access that level of personal leadership which supports you to play whatever role you're playing. So we hope it's useful just to begin this webinar with an opportunity just to reflect for yourself. In an ideal world, and I'm sure many of you will have heard this old adage many times before, that before we can effectively lead other people, we should focus on being able to lead ourselves. And while I wholeheartedly agree that it's very important that leaders should be able to lead themselves, it doesn't always work out quite that simply or quite that easily. In fact, if I think about the leaders that I work with and across the systems of the various sectors that I operate in, it's often that people find themselves in leadership roles much earlier than when they'd even thought about how they're leading themselves. So in that sense, the role, in fact, precedes the idea of reflecting about how one is leading themselves. And actually the experiences of leadership actually challenges them. The feedback that they receive actually prompts them to actually think about how they are in fact leading themselves. So I think in leadership development we do have these more idealized ideas around well, you really need to be able to lead yourself before you lead other people. But in fact, what we see happening most often is in fact people get feedback from their environment or from the relational leadership they're experiencing, the team leadership they're experiencing, or even their experiences across the system, and they realize, actually, there's something here for me to learn about how I'm managing myself, how I'm interacting with other people, and how that I'm actually taking on that learning in a way where I'm effective in my personal sense of leadership. And in that sense, if we look at how leaders learn to lead themselves, you won't be surprised to see the kind of reflective learning cycle, or the like a PDSA cycle, for those who are familiar with that more lean-oriented approach, that actually what happens is that people take some action, they review the impact of that action, or in fact get feedback about that action, they reflect on the experience that they have, and good leaders, people who really are interested in developing and learning to lead themselves and be effective across the different layers or levels or lenses of leadership that we've talked about, in fact then develop a sense of self-understanding or self-awareness so that they can be more effective in what they're doing. So in that sense, we can think about the process of learning to lead oneself as one that requires appraisal and reappraisal, a continuous system of actually getting to know yourself and getting to know yourself at quite a deep level, so that you can manage that inner stability to be able to express what's important to you as a leader. So if we move into some sort of definition, or towards one, because it's actually one which I imagine is always growing and changing, and it's certainly developing for me personally as I learn more about how to lead myself. I guess my approach would be that effective personal leadership requires people to really establish quite a deep understanding of who they are, about what's important to them, what they value and how they operate. So in that sense, knowing who you are and knowing what's important to you is quite core to reflecting on how do you express that in how you're leading yourself through the rest of the leadership that we've talked about, the different lenses. In that sense, I think personal leadership also involves maintaining some sense of inner stability, so that when we're impacted by various forces, whether it be relational or systemic, or even from the teams and groups that we're experiencing or that we're working with, that someone who's leading themselves well actually maintains and structures some sort of inner core of stability, so that they're able to align their behaviors, align their responses and their reactions with what's really important to them. And through that, they're able to express themselves authentically through how they lead and influence. It's not just a reactive process. Now, I know that sounds quite idealized again, but actually having a core, stable way of how you lead yourself is much more likely to support that sort of authentic leadership and influence moving forward. People who lead themselves effectively also work hard at understanding what their strengths are, what they're really good at, and those areas where they need to develop. And it's, it's that, again, that idea of using their strengths really well to actually address some of the development areas which are there for them. And if I think about some of the people that I've worked with over the years who are tremendously successful and effective in how they're leading other people, they are also highly aware of that personal leadership around their strengths and development areas. And they've been really willing and consistent in their ability to work on themselves, so that they are actually having the impact on others that they intend. And in that sense, I'm not suggesting that it's a process which comes easy for people. In most cases, where I've worked closely with leaders who are working hard to lead themselves, it comes with all sorts of challenges, and it takes courage, and it takes honesty with oneself in order to actually access that stability to be able to lead the way you want to lead. So I guess personal leadership is the lens of thinking about, am I expressing the kind of leadership that I want to express in the way that I interact, not only with myself, but through to others. to organizations and teams and through the systems. So I guess it begs the question again, and we're going to invite you just to have another bit of reflection time here about what the tools and methods are, or the approaches that you currently use to develop and express your personal leadership. So just, again, use this as an opportunity to give yourself a little bit of time to reflect on what is it that you currently do to actually manage yourself so that you can express the personal leadership that you want. And as leaders or people working in leadership development, many of us use tools and approaches to lead others all the time. You know, we're very aware of the latest idea, the latest technology, the latest approach or model in how we lead other people or interact with other people or systems or teams. But how often do we actually apply these to ourselves? How often do we think about how are we utilizing what we know about leadership to actually tune in and make a finer tuning of our own instrument ourselves? So just spend another couple of minutes now. What are you currently doing to develop and express your sense of personal leadership? Okay. So we thought it's useful to share with you some ideas or some of the important elements about what's involved in developing personal leadership. And these have been developed from consultations with the various people involved in TPC around the world in different areas. So in a sense, this has some shared view from TPC, but they're by no means a complete list. It's just some of the themes or elements that we think are really important or that we've noticed really successful leaders actually attend to. So what we find is that people who are really effective in leading themselves or in fact expressing that level of personal leadership have spent some time understanding the maps and models that are relevant to that sense of personal leadership. So you can ask yourself, for example, how much do you know about the different models of leadership that might be important or useful for you to know about? And I'm not going to ask you to rate yourself or anything like that, but it's useful to ask yourself these questions. You know, how familiar are you with the maps and models that are relevant to personal leadership? And, you know, how do those models that we know about, and you can think of the various models or the different types of leadership. You probably all know about Goldman's suggested types of leadership, ideas like systemic leadership. You can think about things like servant leadership. So how are those models, and what important models, what models do you find are important, in fact, and how do they relate not only to leadership in general, not only to leading other people, but how do they relate specifically to you? And how can you apply them to yourself? You know, do you know what your dominant or default leadership style is? Do you know that about yourself? Do you know what are the models and maps that you can use to actually support yourself, to actually lead yourself more effectively? And, you know, are you familiar with different styles of leadership that might be able to support you in different circumstances? So as I say, people who do lead themselves effectively have a view of the maps, but not only apply them to others, they also think about them for themselves. We've also found that people who are really effective in expressing personal leadership or leading themselves have put the effort into developing self-awareness and personal insight. They've got a sense of what it is that they do in order to understand themselves. So they close the gestalt of that PDSA cycle that I mentioned before, and they do the work, they do the reflective work that's involved in actually understanding themselves and taking learning out of their experiences. So we could ask questions for ourselves like, how well do you feel you understand yourself as a leader? And, you know, what are your natural predispositions in how you lead yourself? So going beyond the leadership styles or the types of leadership into thinking about, well, how do I, what's my default position in actually how I lead myself? What can I learn about myself and how I lead myself from the various psychometrics and feedback tools? What practices am I using to develop a greater sense of self-awareness? So many of the leaders that we know who develop that self-awareness and personal insight engage in various processes around mindfulness or a routine which involves reflection and awareness raising about how they're leading themselves. And alongside of that, they engage in a reflective learning process, so they keep track of what they're learning about themselves and keep building on their insights. So it's a reflexive act. There's learning from the learning, and that creates another loop in terms of what they're thinking about for their next leadership experience. We also find that people who are effective at leading themselves have spent some time really understanding and managing themselves. So it's that more psychological process now of actually managing their own inner world, managing their thoughts and their feelings and their hopes and wants in a way to actually create a sense of inner stability. It's knowing what's important to you. It's knowing what your values are and knowing how to express them in a way so that you create stability in that. And then when conflicts arise internally between the different parts of ourselves or the different wants that we have or the different impulses that we experience, there's a process for actually managing that to create the stability that we've been mentioning. You could ask yourself, for example, how well you feel that you express the uniqueness that you have, if you're expressing your potential in the best way that you can. People who seem to lead themselves really well also say or also display elements where they're actually remaining present to themselves, and this again speaks to that sense of a routine practice for actually learning and developing in a more planned and thoughtful way. There's also this idea of managing mood and motivation. So, you know, people who lead themselves really effectively have spent some time thinking about that and have put energy into creating the mood and motivation that they want. They know what actually drives them, and they actively work towards opportunities to express that. We've also found that people who are effective at leading themselves have spent some time understanding and developing their own leadership journey. So, you know, we could ask, for example, how well you feel you know about and can articulate your own leadership journey. So what's it been, what have the important lessons been for you in how you've developed as a leader? What is the journey going forward? So how have you managed yourself through the various experiences that you've had and the transitions that you've experienced, not just in your career or in your roles, but in your development as a leader? So how have you managed yourself through different leadership transitions? And how have you led yourself when it was time, or is time, in fact, to follow someone else? So the whole concept of followership is part of understanding one's own leadership journey. And we could say, for example, how well can you say that you know about where you've come from, that you know about and confident to articulate where you are now in your leadership journey. You can also say, how well do you feel you can articulate where you're headed as a leader? So that it seems that people who are effective with this idea of personal leadership have a sense of how they're growing and developing and can articulate what's important to them at these different levels and these different times in their own leadership journey. And part of that is knowing how they can stay motivated and inspired along the way. There's also an element where people who express personal leadership really well have understood and developed some vision of themselves as a leader. So you could ask, for example, how well you feel you've created your vision of yourself as a leader, and where do you feel your understanding of leadership's developed from? What's influenced that? So what's your philosophy on leadership? What's important to you as a leader? And how does your vision for yourself relate to a broader, a wider sense of meaning and purpose that you have in your life? And then in how you manifest that vision or work towards expressing that vision, how attuned do you feel to actually having a sense of purpose or mission across that journey, and how much do you feel that mission actually sustains and nourishes you? And part of that vision is having a sense of what's coming next. How do you feel you're becoming? Who do you feel you're becoming as a leader? And what's your plan for your ongoing development through that? So again, these are questions that we find that people who lead themselves really well ask themselves and acquire skills in expressing. People who lead themselves really well also tend to develop this idea of personal resilience. And I know people, it's quite popular to talk about personal resilience now. But, you know, leaders who can sustainably lead themselves have a sense of, you know, we could ask you, for example, how resilient do you feel you are and what's contributed to that? And what do you do to maintain your personal resilience? So people who express personal leadership have a good sense of what they're doing to actually lead themselves in a resilient way and stay healthy and positive as the leader. There's also an element of personal resilience which involves managing stress and sustaining high performance. So we find that people who express personal leadership actually have processes that they use and systems that they put into action in order to manage themselves and, you know, attune to when they're under stress, and they change their behavior according to that in order to maintain and sustain their performance. And related to that is the broader question that many of us, I'm sure, think about how they actually manage the balance in their lives. The work-life balance is one way to think about it, to sustain this strong sense of personal resilience. And finally, and this is just one other lens, is that people who seem to lead themselves well have also developed and acquired skills in putting their insights about personal leadership into action. So you could ask yourself, for example, how do you set a strategy for expressing yourself as the leader you want to be, and what do you do to actually put your learning into action? What processes do you use, and what plans have you got or goals have you got for actually expressing personal leadership? So the research into people who lead themselves really well shows that actually these people hold it as an important value, self-leadership, and in fact have plans, have goals, have development processes in place to express the leadership that they want. You could ask, for example, how you sustain your plans and how do you be accountable to yourself in expressing the leadership that you want. And really, there's a sense that when I'm leading myself really well, the insights the awareness, the various learning that I experience is put into action. And I think that's a really important part of the success behind people who lead themselves really well. They hold as a value putting their learning into action. So thinking about this as a model, these different sort of different elements that are important, what we've done through the Virtual Leadership Summit and what you can experience today around personal leadership, I just want to give you an overview of the things that you can access today. So first off, there's the webinar from me. And some people have said that it's useful to actually reflect on those different elements. So what we encourage you to do is play this back to yourself if you want longer time to think about the different elements around how you're leading yourself. So whether it be about developing resilience, ask yourself those questions. Whether it is about maintaining that sense of inner stability, ask yourself those questions and use it as a reflective device and tool. You'll also have access to a webinar offered by my colleague Damien Wamfer, who's another partner in the UK, TPC business. And he will offer a webinar that actually talks about self-awareness and how it relates to personal leadership. And we hope that you'll find this as a useful mechanism to start some of the planning around how you want to lead yourself and developing that self-awareness that we know is at the heart of all personal change. There's another webinar by Steve Blackwell, also from the UK business, where he explores the link between some of the leadership styles that many of you are aware of and the climate that people create around them. And he also talks about some of the psychological factors that can influence and lead us in the choices that we make. So here's an opportunity to look at some of the current thinking about different leadership styles or different approaches to leadership, and what's your personal take on that. So what style works for you and doesn't work for you, or what style is most helpful for you in thinking about how you want to express your own personal leadership. Hilary Harvey, one of our associates, provides you with an opportunity to think about how you use your voice in how you lead yourself. So leaders who are really effective use themselves as an instrument to actually express the kind of leadership they want. And this is a really fun exercise, a webinar where Hilary is going to actually guide you through a series of reflective and practical exercises to create a greater awareness about how you can use your voice to establish more authority, presence, and impact in how you lead. There's also a webinar from Beth Chadwick, who is going to offer you a series of, or a framework really, for thinking about how you create and sustain a vision for yourself as a leader. So what you'll be doing is talking you through the importance of having a mission and a vision, and how you can actually create that to support your journey towards more authentic and effective leadership. And then a colleague from Australia, Joseph D'Souza, is sharing with us a video about, and he poses the question, can you be a leader and still really be a human being? Which is a way of thinking about what's the important life experiences, in fact, which are essential for expressing the many leadership qualities that are important to us all, and above all, how we maintain a sense of self-understanding and growth. There's an article by Marianne Skeptrup around thinking of some of the bigger questions about leading ourselves. So, can we listen to ourselves to find a sense of higher purpose in our lives? And there's another great article by Ruth Sangali, who talks about how to be creative as a leader. And this explores some of the importance associated with developing creativity in a way of personally leading yourself. How can you be more creative as a leader? And finally, there's an article by Frank from the from TPC, where he talks about a way that you can actually identify what your passion is as a leader. He asks what personal leadership is in terms of making personal career that's healthy and balanced and fulfilling. So we hope all of these different elements or these different offerings are going to be useful to support you in your work. And maybe just to really invite you to use these resources to really reflect on and think about how you lead yourself. So the need for personal leadership, we feel, is very, very important. When we are looking at leadership, I think in general people think about how do we lead others, how do we lead a system, how do we lead teams, and this idea of thinking more carefully about leading ourselves is becoming more and more important. People are expecting more congruency and authenticity from the leaders. They're expecting their leaders to bring more personal and emotional sides of themselves to the table. People want to know who's leading them. They want to know that their values are important to them, that they express them. And we can really see evidence for this in the fact that there's a growing interest in concepts like happiness and mindfulness and positive psychology, and also in people understanding some of the shadow or the suppressed parts of leaders. So there is a real call, I think, in the literature and also in the practical business realities for leaders to actually be more open with this concept of how are you leading yourself? And at the heart of that is, do you understand yourself well enough to be able to really tap into the leadership of others? Maybe just to leave you with a thought that the only thing you can really control is yourself. And we hope that this overview webinar today gives you a sense of the many different things you could be doing and thinking and being in relationship to how you actually lead yourself, because it's from that center that you have an impact on the people around you, the organizations and teams you work with, and then the system that many leaders are trying to influence. So just a way of finishing, we want to thank you for tuning in today and being part of our Virtual Leadership Summit. And just invite you to think about what's one of the things that stood out for you today from this webinar. What's an insight that you've had for yourself? And what's an immediate action that you feel you'd like to take as a result of that? So again, it's been delightful to spend this brief amount of time with you thinking about personal leadership, and we hope it gives you an opportunity to both understand a little bit more deeply and raise your curiosity about how you're leading yourself and expressing personal leadership, and hopefully has given you an overview of the resources available to you today as part of our Virtual Leadership Summit. Thank you very much from wherever you've tuned in, and we look forward to seeing you through the week as you explore more about yourself and how you lead others, how you lead teams and organizations, and how you lead across the system, as well as that very important element or area that we're looking at as part of the Virtual Leadership Summit, in how women can be most effective in leadership. Thank you very much for tuning in. Bye-bye.